has done podcasts, which are really popular. It's almost like listening to NPR over and over and over. It's more exciting. So we're very tickled to have her. So if you'll give her a big round of applause, we'll get started.
Thank you so much for coming. I know you could have been literally anywhere in the world today and you chose to come here, and that means the world to me. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you also to the Warren County Bob Kirby Branch Public Library, because again, without them, I would not be here. So I'm very grateful. And I thought I would start a little bit with a little bit about me. I mean, actually pretty much, covered the bases, but just so you kind of know like who I am and like why I can stand up here and talk to you. I don't know, I always appreciate when people are like, I don't know, tell me what I should listen to, if that makes sense. So I have a couple things, like Ashley said, I studied writing. I have a bachelor's in English and a master's of fine arts and creative writing with a focus in nonfiction. I was also an adjunct literature professor for 3 years, and then a limited term professor. I don't know if y'all have that here. It's something I feel like it's specific to the state of Georgia maybe, but did that for a little while. So taught a lot of English composition classes and a lot of world literature classes. And then I also taught gifted kids at creative writing camps. And I just feel like I need to tell you that I was a teacher, because when you teach someone how to do something, it makes you so much better at it, because it's hard to look at your own work and say, here are my mistakes. It's much easier to look at someone else's work and find the mistakes, and then you can apply that to your own. So anyway, I started freelancing while I was teaching too. And in my FFA program, my best friend was here. She also went to this FFA program with me, so if you want to verify it, but they kind of made it seem like we had to choose between being literary and popular. And I don't really think that you have to. I think you can go deep like you want to, and then also there are people who want to hear about it. So I like to champion the freelancing as well. And I had that, this is how people found me, but I had in my byline when I was freelancing that I was working on this book. Like I was just writing it. I didn't have an agent or a publisher or anything. And both my publisher and my agent ended up finding me through that byline, which I think is a miracle. Like I don't know how that happened. I'm really happy it did. But yeah, I always want to make sure that I give freelance online writing the credit it deserves from me, because it helped me a lot. And I still do a lot of freelance writing. I also, like Ashley said, I co-write and host a podcast about women in true crime. Not necessarily that women are always the killers. I mean, they can do that. They can do anything. But they're not just the victims of this story. So that's kind of our focus in the niche. That is the greatest true crime stories ever told. I have it on the last slide. I had on this one too. But it's on iHeartRadio, and I will not let you leave without seeing it. So that's another thing that I'm doing now. I also have 2 more historical true crime books in the works right now. This one, the America's First Female Serial Killer, is the one that's been published. So I have a couple more that are in the works at various stages of finished. And the books are really what I'm here to talk about, because they are the ones where you can do like a real deep dive, spend a lot of time with the subject material. By the way, the plan is for me to talk for about 40 minutes, and then after that, we're going to talk together. So if you think of a question between now and 40 minutes, jot it down or like type it in your phone so you don't forget, because I know that's, the juicy stuff happens in the moment. So, that's me. And then this is kind of what I want to talk about while I'm up here. Basically, there are 4 questions that I usually want to hear when I go to author talks. Like I want people to answer these 4 questions, which are, number 1, why is this important? Basically, like, who cares? What are the stakes here, and what is your point? Like, what are you trying to do? And secondly, how do you research? And that's really important to me, because I want to know how much fact is in this. Like, how much are you making up? How much did you find for real? Which I think is a question that people ask a lot of true crime, and especially creative nonfiction. So I want to talk about that. And then I want to talk about the writing and publishing process just a little bit, because as a writer, I'm sure that some of you are writers as well, it just feels like such a mess, all the time. Like, how do you duplicate that over and over? So I want to talk about that a little bit, and then what are you doing right now is kind of what I like to hear too, because y'all are here. Like, you got dressed, you came here, and that means something. Like, that's a lot of effort, I think, to like show up to a place. So I will tell you some stuff that's like hot off the press before we go, and that's kind of how I want to end. Like, give you something that you can't read anywhere else yet. So a little bit of insider information. But back to the first point, why is this important? So much of the time, writing and reading are really solitary activities. Like, you do them by yourself, you do them for yourself, you get an intrinsic reward from doing it, and it feels great while you're doing it, but then it also kind of lets you forget that it's actually important in the real world too. But it is, and I think there are several reasons for that. And I've highlighted what I think are the top 3 on this slide. So my top 3 reasons why I think this is important. It's entertaining. It also is commemorative, and it provides a perspective. So I'm gonna go through each of these, starting with the fun one. So firstly, historical true crime is fun. It, to me, is a lot more fun than contemporary true crime because, you know, it happened a long time ago, right? The situation has hopefully changed a lot since then, so the terrible things that we're watching or reading about can't usually happen again in that same way, if that makes sense. So there's a bit of an escapism where you can enjoy it more, with that kind of freedom of knowing it probably won't happen like that again. And it doesn't have to have happened 100 years ago for that to be the case either. So, for example, the other night, my husband and I were watching this episode of Narcos. Have any of y'all seen that show? Cool, okay. If you haven't, that doesn't matter. I'm gonna explain everything you need to know. But it's set in Colombia in the 1980s, so like not that long ago. Like not where we would really consider it historical necessarily. But that's why I chose it as an example, because it wasn't that long ago and still so much has changed. So in this episode, Pablo Escobar sends this kid, and I say kid, he's like 18, 20, so like not really a child, but like this kid who's like doesn't know any better, onto this Avianca plane, and the kid doesn't know that his tape recorder is actually a bomb. So the kid has been sent on a suicide mission to assassinate the Colombian president, Cesar Gaviria. And there's this really cinematic moment when the kid is like, okay, they're talking, you know, he's supposed to record a conversation on the plane. So they're talking and he sets his briefcase down and he opens the briefcase and the recorder's right there, and then he pushes record and the screen goes white, right? And then the credits roll, like it's blank and then the credits roll, and my husband turns to me and he goes, oh my God, can that still happen? And the short answer is no, right? I mean, it could, but I mean, he's seen me get pulled aside by TSA because I tried to put a candle in my carry-on luggage, you know, like it's that intense where the reaction is the same because that did happen, right? Like it killed 170 people when that plane blew up. But with the new regulations, and there are a ton of them and I can never get them right because I'm always getting pulled out of the line, but with those new regulations, it's very unlikely they would happen again. So it's a specific moment in time where something like that could happen, and yet we know that it did happen. So my point is, there's a lot of enjoyment to be had from history because it provides that safe distance from those types of horrific and I'm assuming very easy to have happened at that time kind of crimes. And honestly, it's a lot of the time because of those crimes that our lives are safer now. So because of events like that is the reason why it takes me so long to get through the airport. You know, like I have to pad especially through Atlanta, I fly to Atlanta, so in that Atlanta airport, like you get there and you think you're done and then you have to run a 5K. So anyway, we also, one cool thing about this particular example, and a lot of them, especially when they're true crimes, is like we don't have all the information. Like no matter how hard you look, you'll never get all of it because it was a long time ago, and there's typically not a lot of people to ask about it, especially in that one, right? Like everyone who was a witness died. Not a lot of people who were there, you can't ask about it at least. And to go back to that example again, no one really knows whether that kid actually realized he was holding a bomb. But they can deduce it, based on the fact that it would have 100% been a confirmed suicide mission if he had known. Like, he would have had to knowingly agree to do that. And he had a young child and a wife at home, like a young wife that they just got married. So he probably didn't know, right? Like, no one, he never wrote down or said, I didn't know that happened. He didn't have the chance to do that. And even if he had, like, do you believe him? Like, that's, when it's crime, everything's a little bit slippery. Another quick entertainment value mention is when you get to write about historical settings, you really get to lean into that description. And I love that. And that is so fun for a researcher because, I mean, how many words does one need to describe a Gilded Age ball gown? I think all of them. I want, spare no detail, I want to know everything. But you get to do that because your reader wouldn't necessarily know all of those details already. So you get to really dig into some things that you wouldn't necessarily get to if it was contemporary. So that's my slide on fun. Now we're going to go into the second reason why, to me, historical true crime is so important. Because aside from being fun, you get to honor your subjects in a way that probably hasn't been done yet. So by expanding the full story, you get to not only explore the narrative as contemporary culture remembers it, like the narrative that we know, but you also get to really dig into the research to figure out why that narrative is the one that survived. Because there's always more than one story. And we also get to learn why other versions are the ones that were obscured. And you get to re-examine that circumstance with, hopefully, a more objective perspective provided by the passage of time. So I have another example for you. So when I was writing about Jane Chopin, which is the book that I mentioned in the beginning, the first American female serial killer, I never wanted to equivocate on her behalf. I mean, she was the worst. Like, there's no way around it. She's a monster, and to say anything otherwise would be pretty irresponsible. Like, she's a terrible person. But the story as it existed really only said that. Like, it omitted a big part of her life. Like, all of her childhood was just a wash. And I feel like there's some very formative experiences in there that, even though they didn't justify anything that she did, were important to at least acknowledge. And I think that that is important to the genre as a whole because of the way that true crime as a genre is playing out. So to consider like other perspectives and a fuller story is a big part of that commemoration. Even when you're commemorating someone who like maybe doesn't deserve it, you know, there are people coming down the line or people, victims and that kind of thing who do deserve to be remembered. And that's where the perspective part comes in. So earlier I said that much of the world has changed since whichever historical true crimes were committed. And a lot of that change, I think, comes from human education. So we know more, so we understand more. For example, I'm going to tell you another example. I think the examples are the fun part, honestly, but this is about a little piece I did, a freelance article last week about King George III. He has been all in popular culture lately. He's in Hamilton, he's the king with like the long train, and he's also the nutty husband of Queen Charlotte in the Shonda Rhimes show. But even with very little evidence, and it's limited by all sorts of factors, the biggest one being it was like hundreds of years ago. Even with that, our contemporary knowledge can support the theory that King George III likely had manic depression, in addition to some symptoms that actually came from weird old school cures that his physicians gave him. So like they were giving him weird stuff that made him have symptoms that made him look crazy, but really it was a product of the medicine, if that makes sense. So he probably wasn't the, quote, mad king tyrant who was unfit to rule, which is what our Declaration of Independence says about him. But with a little perspective, we can understand why people might have thought he was, especially Americans. I mean, we had zero problem believing that a colonial king was crazy. On the other hand, British physicians kept trying to diagnose him with physical ailments. So there's still, to this day, they keep trying to diagnose him with physical things. Probably because that's an easier pill to swallow. It's like easier to digest than the possibility that the king who had been handpicked to me, the pursuit of that concept is worth the effort. So even if I don't find out like what was King George dealing with, even if I never find out, I know what everyone contemporarily thought, and I know what experts with that information thought. So I feel like I have a better perspective of what it could have been, right? And to me, that's worth the effort. And I think it's important to know why your work is important. Otherwise, like, why do it? You know, like, it's just, it's for no reason. And I also thought it might be interesting to y'all as readers to know how I go about hunting down this information. And a big thanks again to my host, by the way, because without libraries, this job would be literally impossible. So thank you again for having me. All right, let's talk about research strategies. These are my 3 strategies. Like I said before, I write historical true crime mostly, and that does require a lot of research. All writing requires a lot of research. But, so even if you're not writing historically, even if you're reading only, not writing at all, this information could still help inform that experience. So my biggest 3 research strategies are to not let the paywalls hold you back, but also don't pay $200 a source because that is not sustainable. Number 2 is read everything you can find. And number 3 is go to the place. Travel to the place all you can. And because it really changes perspective. I'm gonna take each of these one by one, but before I do that, I don't know if y'all can see that picture over there to the left. This is a library in Massachusetts where I got to research the book, America's First Female Serial Killer. I know it's kind of hard to see with the coloring, but there's like gilded window panes, and it was free to look at all of their stuff. And they let me access this 100-year-old court transcript of Jane Toppin's trial, which you can see next to it. And I'm not really sure why it's typed. I don't know if like it was a transfer of handwritten notes or what, but it felt old when I was holding it. It was really cool. Which brings me to my first point. Okay, here are my strategies on avoiding a paywall, but I really want the information, but I don't have the money for that. These are a bunch of tactics I learned from trial and error on a shoestring budget. I found that Google has the most user-friendly search engine, especially Google Scholar. Most of the results are behind a paywall though, which is understandable, but again, unsustainable. Like, I'm not saying it's not worth $200 to read that article. As a writer, I can tell you it's worth $200, but it's unsustainable when you need to get a lot of them. So I use their search engine. I use Google search engine. I just use them, and then I stop when they want me to pay. And then I write down the publication information of the documents that I want to access, and then I go to the library because it's witchcraft. They're so good. It's actually a good default. I think if Google's not turning up what you want anyway, the library will know where it is. I don't know how they navigate this labyrinth, but they do, and it's amazing. You can also write down the byline of the text you want and try to find them through WorldCat or your public library's catalog. I did that a lot, especially during COVID when we weren't really supposed to go anywhere. I would try to find it at home first. And then sometimes the freeness, like how free a library is, seems too good to be true, but it's not, it's real. Like, you can use it and it's here for you. They're also really helpful for viewing texts that are rare or out of print, but they're still in circulation. So even if you can't like buy it on Amazon, there's a good chance that your library will have it or can get it to you, which is, again, magic. And also, even though they seem really exclusive, university libraries are usually open to the public too, which I just like was begging one day, and they were like, yeah, sure, come in, we just need your ID. I was like, okay, I will see you in 15 minutes, or however long it takes me to get there with Atlanta traffic. You do have to go in more if you're going to a university library because they want to know who you are. But in Atlanta alone, I've done to undersell Wikipedia wormholes. I found some truly disturbing facts about Gilded Age hygiene by falling through the Wikipedia wormhole. And even though the site, we know like Wikipedia is not a credible source, it's not scholarly reviewed or anything like that, all of their sources are at the bottom of the page. So if you're like, I don't believe that, let me go check your facts, you can do that, it's right there, it's just one hyperlink, it's really cool. That's actually another good default, is like if you find a source that it's like, this is the one, this is exactly what I was looking for, you can go look at their sources and get a whole bunch more that are really close to what you wanted. Yeah, that's probably my best advice actually if you're doing historical research, is use your sources. Okay, so another tip that I learned through trial and error is that even information that seems ancillary can be pretty helpful, especially when you're recreating a historical world. So for example, when I was doing preliminary research for my forthcoming book called Madam Queen, I saw this picture with this quote on Pinterest. And obviously, I was immediately hooked. I needed to know everything about her. For some quick background, Stephanie Sinclair owned one of the most successful gambling rings in 1930s Harlem. She held her territory against mafiosi like Dutch Schultz and Lucky Luciano. And before I visited, so this is again the traveling thing, before I visited the Museum of the American Gangster, I had never heard her name. Me, like I am a true crime junkie who is embarrassingly attracted to mob stories, and I had never heard of her. So I took a photo of the photo on the wall, it was just like a little frame, took a photo of the photo, and then I reverse image searched her, and that's what led me to that Pinterest article. And then after that, when I got home actually, although New York Public Library, I have used them as well to research her, they're great. After that, I located the actual article that this came from through the research methods that I just outlined. And while I was sorting through the microfilm at Emory University's library, which is exactly as glamorous as it sounds, it's just like in the movies, I got to see the whole newspaper article, not just her headshot from the advertisement. And I'm going to show you that. So there's so much around her article here, like the ads on the sides. So librarians and archivists use this term enduring value when something is valuable in itself throughout history, which I think her article would qualify as having enduring value. But I find that the other stuff too, like you wouldn't necessarily preserve an article about like back pain or Dr. Bloom, the dentist, but it's really valuable when you're recreating a story because it clues you into what contemporary people were seeing and feeling and thinking, and that can be really valuable when you're rebuilding that world. Also, this is just a fun little aside. I don't know if you can see that little blurb in the upper left-hand corner about the Hotel Olga. You barely see it, it's like under the headline. But that one hotel, it doesn't exist anymore. It sent me down a long rabbit hole that led to the likely setting of an illegal meeting that's completely off the books. Like there's no record of that meeting happening. It definitely did happen. It has to have happened. But because we're dealing with criminals, no one wrote it down. So it's really hard to research until you find, little tidbits like in the ancillary parts. And sometimes when you're reconstructing historical narratives, especially when you're writing about intentionally slippery characters, you have to make some educated guesses. And that's when it gets really fun again. So my initial drafting process is just as messy as everyone else's, but for the sake of this talk and talking to you, I broke it into 3 stages. The first one is to gather everything, the second is to outline facts, and the third is to draft the actual story. So granted, this list makes it look a lot more linear than it is. I mean, I almost never have gathered everything I need when I sit down to draft this story. So it's more of a cyclical thing, but you have to start somewhere. Like you have to be like, these are the 3 things I'm going to get to, even if you end up circling back to the first one. 2, I get asked that question a good bit. The tipping point of when I know it's time to move from stage 1 of gathering things to stage 2, when you actually start outlining, is when the research starts repeating itself. Like it repeats itself more than you're getting new stuff from it. So if you're checking your sources and they're all agreeing and you're not getting any new juicy stuff from it, you can probably go ahead and start outlining. That doesn't mean you're done researching by any means, but it means you can go ahead and move on a little bit to the next section, the next stage. And I follow this process for every scene. So of course, you gotta start with the big picture, and then you start with the overarching narrative. Here are the acts. Here are the parts of the acts. Here are the chapters. And then here are the actual scenes that I want to play out on the page. And when I get to that level of detail, these are the steps that I use. Still, it's always a mess, but some scenes are a lot messier than others. And sometimes there's only one account of an event, which is what I ran into a lot when I was researching Jane Toppin. That's for several reasons. Because of the time period, it was like Gilded Age, right? So paper was kind of scarce. We were reusing a lot of it and reusing a lot of it until it was destroyed. There also were fewer papers. She was also a woman. She was also working class. It also happened right at the same time as President McKinley's assassination. So she was overshadowed a lot by that news coverage, even though, she killed 35 people, but at least that we know of. But McKinley though, right, that veterinarian, he didn't take that bullet out, and that is bad. We need to know about that too. So, yeah, so that's what happened with Jane, is like, it's a lot of times I would get like one story of the event and have to do a lot of ancillary research, or things that happened to people like her, that likely happened to her as well. And then sometimes, if it's a really high profile event, there are 40 versions of what happened. And when you're writing about true crime, and the criminals have control over the media, like they did in the 1930s in New York City, some of those accounts directly contradict each other, which is fun and frustrating. So, for the sake of example, I chose a scene from Madam Queen to walk y'all through, and that is the Stephanie Sinclair book about the gambler, or the gambling ring owner. I don't think she actually gambled. So yeah, step 1 is to gather everything and to keep it in one place, and that is the hard part because you get too excited to keep track of it. So it's crucial to organize from the very beginning, including all of your source material. And your bibliography itself is very, very important in case you will definitely lose that source material. Because I know if y'all are like me at all, you've definitely had 25 tabs open at the same time, and then all of a sudden Google Chrome is like, you know what, oh snap, it happened, we're done. And then you have to retrace your steps, and sometimes you can't. So bibliography is very important. I learned this the hard way as well. To keep your sources, as soon as you find them, before you even start reading them, just add them to that list. And I don't know if y'all remember ever being forced to do the annotated bibliographies in school. It felt like so much busy work. It does feel like busy work, but it's still super helpful because you have like your citation and here's everything I got from it. And you hate doing it at the time, and it is so worth having done later. It's like eating vegetables, the annotated bibliography. Yeah, it's really helpful later, especially when, for example, like your editor will be like, what, that doesn't sound right, did that really happen? And you have to be like, yeah, no it did, I just have to find, the cover of the book is red, and I don't remember where it was. So if you have the annotated bib, you can be like, yes, it's here on page 5, go check it. No, I insist you go check it, right? Because I did all of that work ahead of time. So in the scene I was preparing to write here, one of the other gambling kingpins in Harlem, his name was Casper Holstein. So he's a competitor of Stephanie Sinclair. He was also a big philanthropist. He got kidnapped and held for ransom. Over the course of 4 months, the New York Times wrote about it 7 times. I don't know if y'all can actually see that, but you might notice from the titles that about half of them indicate Holstein's race in the headline. And that kind of made me wary of their potential prejudices, so I didn't want to lean too much on those articles. So I leaned more heavily into other contemporary newspapers at the time. It was also covered more extensively in the local Amsterdam News and the New York Age, but anyway, just in case you want to learn from another one of my errors. But yeah, so actually this folder ended up being about 3 times this length of sources for this particular event. So that was my step 1, right, of gathering everything. And this is the outlining the facts. I really don't expect for you to look or even read any of this. I just wanted to show you it for the sake of illustration that it is such a mess. The outline that I put together after referencing 15 or so articles includes both chronological facts, so you see a lot of dates, times even, and notes to myself about it. So like when I read it, was I believing it, or was I like, nah, that's not what happened. I know I just read it in the other one, that's not what happened. I tend to run long in the outline because it's always easier to cut stuff out than it is to add back in later for me. And it really looks like an outline because I always want to make sure at this stage that anything I leave out is very intentional and it wasn't an oversight. So the outline has everything I could possibly ever use. And then you go through and cull and make sure that you get the actual narrative that's important. I think also the main difference between journalism and creative nonfiction is the implication of causality. So everything is still factual, like you're still only using facts or things that are very, very probable, but in narrative, one event causes the next thing to happen, which is, as we know, not how life works at all. Life things just happen and then we give it narrative to make sense about it later. We add the narrative portion to our lives to make sense of it, and that slant that we give it depends on our perspective, which is why the research is important. So, as you can see, or maybe not see, in this image, I've already begun to cross some things out too, because they were either directly contradicted, like Lou said before, or they distracted from the main narrative. So like, yeah, that happened, but it's irrelevant. Like, oh, I don't know why we're talking about that here. Like, we'll save that for later. So I would cross it out. Like, you can see a couple of lines where I crossed them out. I also found what I think is the heart of this scene. So to recap, Casper Holstein, big West Indian gambling kingpin in Harlem in the 30s, former military guy, richer than God, knows everyone in Harlem, and one of the reporters asked him in an interview later, in that highlighted part, which is very small, they asked him on the record if he recognized any of his captors. And Holstein said, on the record, in front of everyone, while he was writing it down, well, you know how it is. I could, but I can't. And then he winked at the reporter. That's what it says. That's what it says right there. So when these are the characters you're working with, and I use the term character very intentionally because they were all about persona and image, you do have to make some educated guesses. Because what did he mean? He meant, of course I know who it was. Like I know everyone. I can't tell you that. So the next part of my writing process is to draft the scene itself. And that's what I'm going to read for y'all. The second draft of this scene, I would never ever subject you to a first draft, oh my God. And then after that reading, which takes about 8 to 10, I think 8 minutes, usually get fired up like halfway through and go a little faster, so about 8 minutes. Then we'll have questions. That sounds good. So this is the new stuff. And it's from the forthcoming book, Madam Clean, about Stephanie Sinclair. I'm just gonna read it to you. So make no mistake, Stephanie Sinclair always knew not to trust the law. Men in groups could not be trusted as a rule. The more exclusive the club was, the less trustworthy. There was no one to keep them in check, so they fed into their own bullshit until they were so caught up in it they couldn't tell which way was up. There were still always tactics to bring these clubs to heel, though. For one, the inexplicable loyalty among the members could be called on as a whole if you hit the right note. Or if you managed to tweeze them apart, pick off a weak link, or foment some kind of mistrust among them, you might be able to rally them to your aid. As a last resort, you could misdirect everyone. Never give the full, whole truth, and never by September of 1928, Stephanie hadn't worked for Holstein in 5 years. When she left in 1923, he was already big in the Elks Club, racing and sporting circles, especially boxing, and he'd started the Turf Club. Since then, he had remained the Turf Club's president, developed real estate to a huge profit, and separated from his wife, whom Stephanie really never knew anyway, which itself was pretty telling. In short, Casper Holstein was a 45-year-old childless bachelor with a lot of disposable income. Thursday, September 20th, 1928, was a night like any other. After an evening at his turf club, he called up his lady friend, Mrs. Gomez Whitfield, who had also been estranged from her spouse for years. He said he'd be there in 20 minutes. He left the brownstone, got in his Lincoln sedan, and had his chauffeur drive him to her place on 225 West 140th Street. Mrs. Whitfield said she never saw him that night. So far, all accounts were consistent, but this is where they diverged. One account said Mrs. Whitfield wasn't home. One account said Holstein didn't make it to her door, but he was seized in the hallway. His official statement said he left her apartment on foot around 1 o'clock in the early morning of Friday, September 21st, but he didn't say why. He was almost home when 5 white men and 2 white women drove up and forced him into their car at gunpoint. They pretended to be policemen, saying he was wanted at headquarters. But if that was true, what if Holstein's chauffeur's statement that he chased the offending vehicle until he lost sight of them? Holstein said on the record that his own driver was nowhere nearby. Holstein said that he cooperated as the kidnappers, quote, hustled him into the machine, though he didn't get a good look at what kind of car they had. It must have been roomy if there were 5 men and 2 women in there. Or was it 6 men and 1 woman? Regardless, all of them were white. Even though he cooperated, one of the men pistol whipped him and the others beat him too before gagging and blindfolding him. Or had they put fogged glasses on him? Glasses sound more chic. By his second interview, Holstein stuck with the glasses. Holstein said he lost consciousness and then regained it before the car pulled up at a house. The kidnappers took him inside and put him in a bedroom, and then they took the bandage, or glasses sometimes, off his eyes. They took his money, either $2,000 or $3,000, or $72, depending on when you read which papers during this 5-day debacle, and his diamond ring, which was worth $2,000. They bound his hands and feet with wire and cloth, they laid him on the floor, and the 2 captors stood guard over him. A few hours later, he was moved to another nearby house. One source said that this was when the kidnappers called Charles King, the Turf Club secretary, and they put Holstein on the phone. He heard Casper's voice shaking when he said, "For God's sake, give these men $70,000 or they'll kill me." But can you really trust the New York Age when the Times made no mention of a phone call and listed the ransom as $50,000? A quick calculation makes it sound like the Age is embellishing by about 40%. An even quicker intuition says someone's trying to buy time. But whether it was Holstein or the kidnappers, it's hard to say. Holstein was held at that house all day Saturday, and then they took him back to the first house that night. His captors offered him food several times, but he could not eat. This much was definitely true. His friends were panicked. He was the president of one elite club and he helped found another. Both groups rallied to his aid without being asked. Holstein also helped so many people with money or clothing over time that several hundred volunteers searched for him through New York for a full day before alerting law enforcement. They correctly assumed that because of Holstein's extra-legal businesses, police intervention might bring about They gave themselves about 12 hours before electing Mrs. Edna Davis at 507 Lenox Avenue to finally call in the kidnapping Friday evening. Police at first treated the case as a missing person, but after an anonymous tip, they soon changed tactics to investigate as a kidnapping. A different story says that Saturday morning, 24 hours later, was when one of the male kidnappers telephoned the secretary of the turf club, that's Charles King. The caller told him to go to an office in a store at 1251 Washington Avenue in the Bronx, later identified as the office of Michael Bernstein, 32 years old, and he demanded, quote, $17,000 ransom. Well, that's a big difference. If the papers can't keep that big of a dollar figure straight, what else are they missing? Detectives later learned that Bernstein had gone to a branch of the American Exchange Irving Trust Company at Southern Boulevard and 167th Street in the Bronx to ask if a check drawn by Holstein on a branch of the Chelsea Exchange Bank for $3,200 would be honored. The tellers said they would not cash the check. So rather than fraud, it appeared like Bernstein would orchestrate a kidnapping instead. Or it would be made to appear that he had orchestrated a kidnapping. When Charles King went to the office, Bernstein proved that he had custody of Holstein by showing him some telegrams Holstein had on his person sent Thursday afternoon. Afterward, he increased the ransom demand, raising the price to $50,000. Late Sunday night, they returned his ring. They kept his cash. The captor said he'd be returned home without being harmed. You got a raw deal, the kidnapper told him. Holstein said he didn't call anyone, and to his knowledge, no demand was made for money. That made no sense to anyone. What was the point of a kidnapping if not to extort a ransom? The Age reported that Secretary Charles King said detectives trailed him to the rendezvous where he was to pay the ransom. The kidnappers did not appear to claim their money, but who can be sure? The newspaper then reported that Casper Holstein was a well-known philanthropist. Just before his kidnapping, he sent, quote, a large consignment of lumber to Negro storm victims in the Virgin Islands. He also tried to raise funds for similar relief, which should have happened on the day the newspaper reported. Just in case any readers were doubting the altruism of this criminal. This is when Stephanie got invested in the story. Not that she didn't care what happened to her former employer or former supervisor and now colleague. Of course, she didn't want anything to happen to this person or his money. But this spin was incredible. No one knew who to believe. She was sure it was because of a clever circumvention on the part of Holstein himself, because even if journalists were friendly, they knew that mudslinging could end in them being blacklisted. Especially when such powerful people were involved. The question for Stephanie became not what happened, but how did he do that? And perhaps more importantly, why was he obscuring the identity of the people who had kidnapped him at all? And why did they deserve his protection? Was it a favor to someone powerful? Did he undergo this hostage situation and come out with the proverbial one in the bank? 5 white male subjects were arrested the night of Saturday, September 22nd, in front of the Commonwealth Sporting Club on 125th Street and Madison Avenue, when they identified the car used by the kidnappers. But how did they identify it with no eyewitnesses? The subjects were grilled in the West 135th Street station, and while that was happening, one of the kidnappers called Holstein's friend Dennis Armstead of the Monarch Lodge 45 with the Negro Elks. Holstein came on the line, and he told Armstead the police should get out, because if they continue, all you will get will be my dead body. The suspects were held in the tombs. Sunday night, his captors blindfolded and gagged him and drove him, quote, a long way. At 2 a.m. on Monday, September 24th, Casper Holstein was, quote, freed bills for a cab fare to his home and sped away so he couldn't get the tag number. He didn't go home though. Instead, he went to his turf club at 111 West 136th Street. Clubs and friends greeted him enthusiastically after fearing he would be killed. Then Holstein went to the police station to give his statement, which lasted more than an hour. Tuesday morning, he could not identify any of the 5 men in a lineup held as suspects in his kidnapping. By Tuesday night, September 25th, Casper Holstein was back in sporting circles, tailored to the last crease, reporters said, and as suave as ever. A pile of telegrams congratulated him on his return, and men clustered around him to shake his hand. At the turf club, one reporter asked him, "Didn't you recognize any of your captors?" Holstein smiled and said, "Well, you know how it is. I could, he winked, but I can't." It was genius and no one knew what to do with it. Everyone directly involved felt like they were in the right and they'd done their part to uphold justice. Everyone on the outside was so frustrated and confused they just rubbed their eyes at the column and moved on to the next thing. Be it an advertisement for a fur collar winter coat or more news about some corrupt judges. Stephanie was in a unique adjacent category, close enough to see how Holstein had deployed the smoke and mirrors, but far enough away that she did not know what was behind them. It was safer not to know, and she didn't need to find out. She had problems of her own now, and she wanted to address them in the skillful, practical way that Holstein had done. That's it. Now it's Q&A time. Y'all want to talk about anything? Yeah.
How do you choose your historical figures that you decide to work on as topics? Since there is so many, especially, in crime no less, there's a ton of different
Definitely.
people. So how do you weed that down and say this one? I agree with Stephanie. St. Clair's an interesting topic.
Thank you.
Just for who she was, she's fascinating. But how do you decide? I guess.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And it is really hard to decide. And it's like, to your point, there's so many to choose from. It's really like, which one do I do first, you know? For me, I'm a reader first. So when I learned that Jane Tompkins existed, for example, I was like, oh, I'm gonna go read a book about her. And I couldn't find one. Like, I couldn't find one that I liked. So I was like, someone needs to read that book. I did find one, and it's Harold Schechter. And if y'all ever watch like Investigation or ID Channel, you've seen him before. He is like the guy. And he wrote the book, but it was very much journalism, and I felt like it left out a big part of who she was. So that's how I picked her. Similarly, for Stephanie Sinclair, I just thought she was fascinating, and there wasn't very much written about her. So that's how I end up like settling on the ones. Is like I feel like there's a story there that hasn't been told. But how I find them is through like anything. I could be reading someone else's book, and there's a footnote in there about this other interesting lady, and then I go down the Wikipedia wormhole and I can't really find anything, and then I feel like it's my duty to write about them. And then also just like anytime you are reading or you go somewhere, museums, like traveling, people love to tell like local history stories, and I think sometimes like when they've been around it their whole lives, it doesn't feel as special because it's old hat to them. Like when you come into it as a newcomer, it's like fascinating. So I don't know, is that a good answer?
It is.
Cool. Okay, thank you for asking. That was a great, fun question. What else you got? Yeah.
Hi, in a lot of ways, it seems like I might be your opposite. I
Okay.
just finished my MFA in creative writing.
Cool.
I'm writing.
Congratulations. That's huge.
I'm writing historical fiction about my great-great-aunt who was murdered with an axe and her little boy too. So I'm doing the true crime but fictionalized.
Sure.
I was curious, you said just a minute ago something about the book that the other guy writing about Jane Tompkins was more journalism. How do you see the difference between historical true crime and journalism?
Yeah, I think that's a great question too, and that in a lot of ways is the question, of like where's the line between the fiction and the nonfiction, and I definitely think that the creative nonfiction is in between the historical fiction and the journalism. I think a lot of the the time the motivations behind each genre are really what defines it. Like, the Harold Schechter book is amazing. It's so thorough, and also it's just kind of dry. You know, like all of the facts are there. And while that is very valuable, I don't want all of the facts. I want the good ones. You know, I want the juicy ones. And then I think too, like, if I hadn't been able to find very much about Stephanie Sinclair, I would have not hesitated to call it historical fiction, because I think that really what you call it establishes the contract, like, between you and your reader. As long as you're honest, they're not gonna think you misled them. I think they're both really valuable, and I think too, like, it's almost more honest sometimes to call it fiction, if it is, you know, because it's still historical. Like, you did all the research you can do, there just wasn't that much there. I kind of thought that was how Jane Toppan was gonna go until I kind of cracked it open and found some of Harold Schechter's sources, but, did I answer your question about, like, what the difference is? I think too, I barely mentioned this, but between journalism and creative nonfiction, you imply that some of the facts cause the other facts. And in journalism, that's not really the case. Like, you want to just point out, like, this is where that was, this is where this was. It's just very much facts, not necessarily interpreting them. And I think that's a big distinction for me between journalism and, you know, creating a story out of a thing that really happened. That's a great question. Thank you.
You also mentioned that you did freelance writing
Yeah.
online. Can you tell me, I don't know anything about that.
Sure.
What kind of freelance writing?
Yeah, so a lot of it is still historical, true crime, or even just hidden histories. A lot of it is pitching, like where I'll hear a weird idea. Like, one time, I don't know if y'all have ever seen that show Atlanta with Donald Glover.
So good.
I know, it's so good. They're in France for one episode, and they mentioned Terrar, who is like a cannibal and ate babies, but didn't really, but it's like it's a French urban legend essentially, and I was like, well, I have to go, you know, research that guy. That's like one of the ones where I tried to find something about him and could only find a little bit. And then basically the places that I would go to find it, if they don't have it already, I'll pitch them the idea and be like, it seems like it would be a good fit. I kind of thought you already have it. And sometimes it will work. So I freelance in that way with hidden histories. The archive is one that I like. I like working with them. The lineup is really good for horror things in particular. And then I also freelance on like book roundups and film reviews, or kind of less academic language essays about new release movies. And sometimes essays, but those are a little bit harder to land because they're usually already written and they want to pitch. So usually I'll have an idea and, you know, try to just email the editor and be like, are you into this idea? Here's who I am and here's why I think I should write it. But yeah, that's really fun too, because if there's not a whole lot, if there's not like enough for a book or a whole podcast episode, you can usually write 1,000 words on it. Even if it's just like, here's what we don't know, which is kind of how King George III went, right? It's like, here's some of our facts that we know, and here's how we don't know what they mean. So I think the freelance is really fun too, when you get bogged down with the heavy research of murder and crime, and then you get to kind of wander off and talk about, you know, this guy who may or may not have existed and just had this insatiable appetite, right? So I like to balance it that way. Plus, it's like you don't have to wait that long to get the pay. That makes sense. It's like a month, not like 2 years or whatever. Thank you.
When's your book supposed to come out?
The Madam Queen book will be out in spring of 2025, and America's First Female Serial Killer is out. It has been out for a little bit, and I need to tell y'all where to get that because we don't have them here. Basically, anywhere you want to get a book, you can get it there. Amazon has it, Barnes & Noble. I'll run back and get it at the front so you can see the title. Yeah, so that's what it looks like. The IndieBound one is good for me. I think Parnassus carries it. I think that's close
Is it
to.
just hardback?
It's just paperback.
Paperback?
Paperback, and we also have an audiobook, and it's me reading it. Even though it's in Massachusetts, they like my country accent. They said do it, and I said yes. Yeah, thank you for asking. Did you have a question?
You said you had two major projects in the works. Stephanie Sinclair is one. Can you tell us any about the other one?
Sure, this one's like real new information. So again, we went on a trip, we got to go to Scotland, which if you have any interest in going, do it. It's so cool, it's beautiful. And I know that I was like, it was gonna rain the whole time, it was gonna be a bummer. But everything else is so green, even though the sky is gray. Anyway, if you ever have a chance to go, I recommend it. But they have, I like creepy stuff, I like true crime. They have a centuries-long history of witch trials there. You know, in America, we have like 20 years, they have like 300, right? So I'm just all in when it comes to stories like that. And they had a method of, they were called witch prickers because they wanted the witches to confess, but it was basically torture. And it was almost always, it was always men who would travel from town to town and look at your accused witch and be like, yeah, she's a witch, like, you know, burn her at the stake or in front of a barrel. And they had a lot of different ways of killing people, but really very creative and dark. That's why it's like nice to change it up with the subject matter. But there was one who was revealed to have been cross-dressing, and she was actually a woman. And I was like, I can't, what? Like, I don't understand how that could possibly happen. So that is the one that I'm working on. This is like very early stages of the research to make sure there is enough there. It might end up being historical fiction because it was like 1662. So my sources are limited. Although they are mostly in English, which is very helpful. So yeah, that's the one that I am alternating with when I get those back. Thank you for asking. Do we have time for one more? Y'all have any more questions? I think we're almost at an hour.
This America's First Female, is that an example of creative nonfiction?
Yes, so everything that can check out, all of the facts do check out. Sometimes I had to make some educated guesses, and I try to be very transparent about where that happens. But yes, I think it's an example of creative nonfiction. My marketing team wanted to call it America's First Female Serial Killer and not the first American female serial killer, which is actually the correct. Like that's who she was. She was not the first woman who killed a bunch of people in America. She was the first American one. So, yeah, I think it is creative nonfiction in that it's all the facts, but also the story. Or not all of the facts, but factual story. Thank you. Thank you guys so much for having me. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. And if you want to hang out, hanging
Do you plan to, have this on auto video?
on
I mean, not auto video, on auto books?
this book.
Uh-huh.
Yes, it is an audiobook.
Oh, is it?
Yes, ma'am. It is on Audible, and I think it's on Libro FM as well, whichever one you like. And I'm not sure if it's on Libby, but I think.
Oh, okay, that's good.
Yeah. Thank you. It was fun.
Yeah.
It was really fun.
That's great.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for asking.
No.